Hey guys, welcome back to another US history lecture. Last time when I made my video, we talked about the very beginning of America, and we will be continuing that today. So we will be talking about the colonies more in detail and a little bit closer leading up to the American Revolution that eventually created the United States of America, of course. But anyway, let's get started. So the first colonies, the area that I want to talk about today will be the Chesapeake Bay colonies. And this picture is a representation of the Chesapeake Bay colonies. As you can see, when we talk about the Chesapeake Bay colonies, we really talk about two colonies specifically. We have Maryland here in yellow, and we also have Virginia. And you can see in between we have this body of water, which is the Chesapeake Bay. And anyway, let's kind of talk about what life was like in these colonies. First of all, there was definitely a shorter lifespan, and this was because of the spread of disease. We kind of talked about last time how a lot of people would be dying, and this was mostly due to disease. Disease was one of the biggest killers out there during this time. And half of the people did not live until 20. So that is a huge statistic right there, a huge portion of the population. Imagine right now, half of everyone living in America were to just not live past 20. Few people had grandparents, and obviously if half the people are not living until 20, that means pretty much you can bet that pretty much 90% of the population were not living to be old enough to have grandchildren. So unlike the New England colonies, which were a bit better off than the Chesapeake colonies, they had much fewer grandchildren and grandparents. Another effect of the Chesapeake, there was a huge industry of tobacco farming, and in turn, because people were using tobacco and using up the land to farm tobacco, it was definitely exhausting the land, and which meant that because people were running out of land, people had to move west. Since the Chesapeake is on a coast, you couldn't move east, because if you moved east, then you would obviously run into the ocean. So really the only direction you had left was to move west. And because they moved west, they ran into territories that were already owned by Native Americans, so there was inevitably going to be conflicts between the Native Americans and the colonists who were moving west. So pretty much more tobacco would mean they would need more land to get through it. And because there was more land at the time, the primary source of labor came from indentured servants, and indentured servants were colonists, people from Europe who were paid passage, and they were paid passage to come to America. And this passage was normally very expensive, but these indentured servants had their passage paid off by rich landowners, and in exchange they would work around 5 to 7 years for these landowners. So for a really long time, indentured servitude was the primary source of labor. We have something called the headright system, which is connected to indentured servitude, and it is that 50 acres of land were to be given to the plantation owner, who pays the indentured servant. And the headright system really served to benefit the rich landowners, because kind of like how the wealthy just become wealthier, the wealthy plantation owner would be given even more land to pay for the passage of an immigrant. And as you know, at this time, land really does equal wealth. Now let's talk about a very, very influential and famous rebellion that you need to know. It is called Bacon's Rebellion, and it happens in Virginia. And basically, there's a guy named Bacon, and his crew goes on to kill a lot of natives and burns down Jamestown, which is a location in Virginia. And the causes of this is because more and more settlers didn't have land, and these settlers would be indentured servants and immigrants from the headright system. And as we said, indentured servants, the way the design was supposed to work for indentured servitude was that they'd work for maybe 5 or 7 years, and then after they're finished with that time period, then they thought that they'd be able to, just live as anyone else, live as any other landowner. But what they didn't realize is that there really wasn't enough land to be able to support all these indentured servants. So what would happen is the indentured servants would, work hard for 5-7 years without getting paid, and then once they were released by their landowners, they had nowhere to go. So that is why they went on a rebellion. And we have this guy, the picture right there is a picture of Governor William Berkeley, and a lot of settlers in Jamestown did not like him because he thought he was being too friendly to Native Americans. And the reason why they did not appreciate Governor Berkeley's friendliness to Native Americans is because they thought that the governor had a job, an obligation to protect the settlers from the Native Americans, but that really wasn't being done because the governor was being too nice to them. And the effects of Bacon's Rebellion was huge. So like I said, the primary source of labor during this time was indentured servitude, but after Bacon's Rebellion, the rich colonists realized that indentured servitude was no longer going to work or be efficient because they would just keep rebelling. So they decided to go with a new labor force, and this is the infamous slavery from Africa. So why did they do that? I just explained it about how indentured servitude became less reliable, and this definitely shows class tensions between the rich and the poor. Now let's talk about something very, very horrible in American history, and that will be the Middle Passage. The Middle Passage refers to the journey on the triangular trade, and you can see a picture of here. This is the triangular trade, and it's called the triangular trade because it's a triangle of goods going from North America to Europe, from Europe to Africa, and from Africa back to North America, or back to the Americas in general. And pretty much the only goods that were really coming from Africa to the Americas were slaves. So the Middle Passage refers to the journey of those slaves, and it was just horrible. Everyone was compact, and obviously the African chiefs did not really care about the well-being of the slaves. So even during this trip, 20% of the slaves died, even during just the journey itself. And they died because of tight living quarters. You can see here they're just stacked on top of each other. They have nowhere to move. They can't even go to the bathroom if they need to. They're just stuck here. They can't walk around or anything. So let's talk about the first few years of slavery, the first few decades. In fact, rebellions did occur as you might expect, but they did not occur frequently. And this is because every time a slave rebellion occurred, what happened is, especially in the South, they would just double down on the protections against slavery. So they'd make the lives of slaves even harder if they were to rebel. So, slaves began to realize that there really was no point in rebelling because not only was there such a low success rate of a true rebellion, but in fact they only made their lives worse by rebelling. And caught slaves would be executed, and slaves that didn't even rebel or didn't even try to escape would just be punished even more. So slaves tried to be content with their lives and accepted their horrible fate rather than making things worse. But let's talk about some of the rebellions that did occur. We have something in New York City in 1712. A dozen whites were killed in the rebellion. Obviously the slaves were the one killing the whites, and 21 blacks were executed. Then we have another rebellion that comes up a lot in the AP test, and it is the Stono River Uprising, which happens in South Carolina, 1739. And 50 blacks rebelled and tried to go to Florida, which was not a colony, which was not an American colony, but was owned by Spain. But they were stopped by the militia. And just something to know is no slave revolt in history matched the scale of Bacon's rebellion. So we talked about how indentured servitude became a thing of the past after Bacon's rebellion because of how big Bacon's rebellion was. However, if you expected something similar to happen in terms of slavery, it did not. There was no slave rebellion that matched the scale of Bacon's rebellion. Let's talk about the New England family. So we're gonna take it back up to the New England colonies and kind of talk about their lifestyles. We had the creation of towns, which meant that more families were going to be living closer. And in the New England colonies, they definitely had education as one of the more important aspects of life, and 50 families mandated. If you had a town of 50 families, that means that a school was going to be mandated. Another thing about the New England colonies is that they had clean water and cooler temperatures than the southern or the middle colonies, and this definitely slowed the spread of killer diseases. Life expectancy was actually higher, and if you were to be an immigrant that came to the New England colonies, you can expect to, in fact, add 10 years to your lives instead of it shortening. So longer life expectancy definitely leads to closer-knit families. We talked about just a few minutes ago how the Chesapeake Bay colonies, they didn't have grandchildren or grandparents because they were dying so quickly. However, with this longer life expectancy, more families were being created. So population definitely increased through procreation as well. So families were being formed, and not just from immigration. And something else to note is that women, when they marry their husbands, they do give up any property rights they may have had. Now let's talk about something called the Halfway Covenant, and we will also talk about the Salem witch trials. Basically, the Halfway Covenant was an increased membership to the church, but by doing so, it sacrificed religious purity. So basically, to be a member of the church, it was definitely very difficult because you had to follow all of these rules, be born to the right families, and it was very difficult for just the average person like you or me to fulfill these requirements. So church membership was declining very, very quickly, and therefore to kind of counter that and increase church membership, something was created called the Halfway Covenant, and it really lessened those restrictions on joining the churches. But in doing so, as you may expect, it does definitely sacrifice religious purity. So the increase in membership definitely separates the elect from members of society, and the elect are these top tier individuals that we just mentioned about how these guys are the pure people that were born to the right families. Then we have something called the Salem witch trials, which you may have heard of, and basically it was the poor farmers that were accusing those from the merchant class that were making money of being witches, and this definitely illustrates tensions between the rich and the poor. Now let's talk about how each of the colonies dealt with interracial marriages and the mingling of races. In the South, the population was pretty much completely Anglo-Saxon, but they had 20% of their population as Africans in the form of slaves. In the New England colonies, it was very, very not diverse, and this was because of Puritan roots. And in the middle colonies, we saw that there was the most amount of white immigrants, especially in Pennsylvania. And a lot of people would immigrate to Pennsylvania because we talked about this in my last video, but Pennsylvania, which was founded by William Penn, it is one of the only colonies to be fully religiously tolerant. So why is the South not receiving a lot of white immigrants during this time? Well, the South at this point had pretty much completely converted to using African slave labor as their pretty much only source of labor. So as a white immigrant, it really made no sense to go to the South because there would be no job opportunities because the only people that were working in the South were these slaves. So it really made no sense for these, if you were a white immigrant, to go to the South, but rather to the Middle or the New England colonies where slavery wasn't as big and wasn't as rooted into the culture, where you might be able to find a job opportunity. Let's talk about what working looked like in America. We had a slow-growing British population, and it leads the colonists to look elsewhere to sell their goods. And by 1775, the bulk of tobacco is being sold to France and other European countries. And this is bad because it goes against the idea of mercantilism. And the mercantilism pretty much is the idea that the colonies exist to pretty much make money for the mother country. So in this case, the British colonies, any goods that the British colonies might get, either through mining or through farming, the idea is that they should sell all those goods, or not even sell, but just give all those goods back to the mother country, which in this case is Great Britain. However, by these colonists selling their goods to other colonies or through other countries like France, it really goes against this whole idea of mercantilism. So I just explained how, and it definitely adds to the conflict between the colonists and Britain. And this is one of a few big points of conflict that will arise between the colonists and Great Britain, which will eventually lead to the colonies declaring their independence from Great Britain and leading to an entire war. Now I'll talk about another event, which is called the Great Awakening. And this is when more individuals convert as in becoming part of the church and become religiously active again. So the Great Awakening refers to the religious revival in the 1730s and the 40s, and it will be the first of many mass social movements in American history where a huge portion of the population all decide to do this specific thing or follow an event. And the cause of the Great Awakening, we first had boring sermons. So at churches, pretty much what makes up a session at the church would be just listening to a really long and boring sermon, which would be just a preacher reading off a scripture. We have something called Arminianism, and that directly challenges the Calvinism's doctrine of predestination. We talked about this last time, but you should definitely know that Calvinists thought, and Calvinists as well as Puritans, they thought that everyone was predestined as to whether they, in the afterlife, they would be going to heaven or hell. And this meant that nothing they do in their real lives would affect the outcome of where they go in their afterlife. But Arminianism was pretty much the opposite and said that what you do in your life dictates whether you will go to heaven or hell. And so, yeah, Arminianism is the belief that individual free will and not God determines a person's eternal fate. And like I said, this definitely challenges Calvinism's and Puritan beliefs. There are definitely some key people you're going to have to know. First, we have Jonathan Edwards, and he is credited with starting the Great Awakening in 1734. And one of his most famous sermons is called "The Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God." And he said that hell was paved with the skulls of unbaptized children, meaning that in his mind, he thought that anyone who wasn't baptized, they would be the ones going to hell. Then we have someone else, George Whitefield, and he used an electrifying new style of preaching. So no longer were there going to be these boring sermons, but this guy, he was like jumping around, screaming, dancing. His style of preaching was definitely something new that was a complete 180 from the boring sermons that most people were used to at this time. And many people were quote-unquote saved during his sermons, meaning that they got baptized. So what are the effects of the Great Awakening? Well, we have these two ideological battles now between the old light versus the new light. And the old light would refer to, the boring traditional sermons before the Great Awakening, while the new light refers to, George Whitefield's type of electrifying new type of sermons. And in turn, new light centers were created. These were pretty much colleges that were created to teach other preachers how to follow this new light sense of preaching. And these centers were Princeton, Brown, Rutgers, and Dartmouth, so all colleges today. And there was definitely an increasing competitiveness of churches, so a lot more churches were coming into formation. And this is actually a strong democratic component because it meant that people increasingly had more choice with religion. They weren't forced to go to a specific church, and instead they got to choose. And this is another example of resistance to established authority. And this is very important because that is one of the key mindsets for the American Revolution, resistance to established authority. Let's talk about the press during the colonial times, what was being printed. First, we have the Poor Richard's Almanac, Ben Franklin. He's the one who wrote it. I'm sure you've heard of Ben Franklin. And it contains sayings from the thinkers of the age, and it really emphasized common sense. There's a picture of Benjamin Franklin right there. And the book was the best-selling book in America, second to the Bible. Then we have a man named John Peter Zenger, also very important. He was a newspaper printer, and in one of his articles, he assailed the royal governor in the paper, and therefore he was charged with libel, and he was sent to a trial. He was defended by a man named Alexander Hamilton, who was a former indentured servant. And the decision of this court case is huge. Basically, the decision of the court case said that John Peter Zenger, he had the right to print whatever he wanted about the royal governor as long as it was responsibly true, because America has a freedom of press. So newspapers after this trial were now free to print responsible criticisms of powerful officials if they were true. Anyway, that's going to be it for today. Thank you everyone for watching. If you have any questions or suggestions, you can definitely email me there at davidkwan5@gmail.com. But that being said, that's all I got for you guys today. Thank you guys for watching, and I will see you next time.